Good evening, everyone. My name's Garner Clancy, and I'm an associate professor here at the University of Sydney Law School. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you to this event. Reflecting on 25 years of the Young Offenders Act, which commenced in April 1998. Before we begin proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. As we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within this university, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within Aboriginal custodianship of country. Some very basic housekeeping. Toilets are located kind of directly behind us down the pathway, and emergency exits are outside of the room to the left or the right. And please turn your mobile phones to silent. I'm delighted to be facilitating this event, and I'm very thankful for those people joining us on the panel, particularly those who have travelled quite some distance. Thank you particularly to Joe and Michaela for the journey, and for you joining us in the room and online. And hopefully those online will be toned down in a moment. Look, this is unlike any event that I've run, certainly in recent times. There's a few risks associated with this event. One risk is that we might be prone to false memories. I think the value of having a big panel is that between us we'll remember something that actually happened 25 years ago. It risks being nostalgic and self-congratulatory. It risks not mentioning important moments and people. This panel could have been far larger, and a few people who had agreed to come who couldn't come at the last minute, unfortunately. But the reality is this work was the work of literally thousands of people. And part of the idea for the event is acknowledging that, the important work done by people around the state who contributed to aspects of the development of the Act and the implementation of the Act. And I personally think it's important to remember history and to celebrate some of the achievements many years on. I'm reminded of a comment by former Deputy Director of the Sydney Institute of Criminology, Paul Ward, at an Institute event on juvenile justice in 1988, he said that follow-up observations 20 to 30 years after a policy change is required but rarely done. And just for the record, I wasn't at that event, I was still at school. I want to briefly introduce the panel members, noting that there'll be also people in the room and people online that are intimately connected with the work that we'll be talking to. And so some of what we'll hear could have been echoed or shared by numerous others. I'd like to mention people on the panel. Jenny Bargan. Jenny was the inaugural director of the Youth Justice Conferencing Directorate and remained the director for a decade, and was involved in many of the activities that contributed to the development of the Act, some of which we'll rehearse or discuss tonight. Louise Blasiosco. Louise worked in the Attorney General's Department between 1995 and 2000. Working on various legislative proposals, including the Young Offenders Act. Louise is currently a director in court services, providing strategic planning and operational advice in the local court, children's courts, coronial court, youth career court, drug court, and probably others.
And district court.
District court. Richard Funston, Magistrate Richard Funston. Richard was a solicitor in charge of the Children's Legal Service for Legal Aid New South Wales from 1998 to 2003, which was a critical period in the implementation of the Act, and is why we invited him to speak. After a long career with legal aid, Richard was appointed as a magistrate in 2018 and is now a specialist children's court magistrate, which is a wonderful asset to all of those interested in youth justice matters. Thank you, Richard. Superintendent Joe Schultz. Acting Superintendent Joe Schultz. Joe's been a member of the New South Wales Police Force for 35 years and was the principal tutor youth at the New South Wales Police Force Academy between 1998 and 2002. And we're going to talk about training and police training as we progress, because it was such a critical part of the implementation of the Act. And I'm going to remind people of what an enormous task that was back then. Michaela Wengert. Michaela was one of the initial team of most excellent conference administrators that Jenny recruited and appointed under the Young Offenders Act in March 1998. Michaela developed, with input from local police youth liaison officers, a training package for specialist youth officers, SYOs, and subsequently worked with Joe Schultz to enhance the training across police. Michaela received a police commendation for this work in 2007. And Jane, Dr. Jane Belitho is online. She's in New Zealand. Jane's a highly respected expert in restorative justice, restorative practices and violence and conflict resolution, and her work explores the experience of those coming before criminal justice systems, the operations of formal community-based justice systems, alternative models of resolution and innovations in justice. And Jane's PhD was looking at youth justice conferencing close to the beginning and part of what was a very rich body of evaluation and research work at the time, which I think was pretty unique given the kind of volume of work that occurred. So it's a fantastic panel with rich, diverse experiences. We will talk, it is informal, it is a celebration predominantly. We will identify things that we probably would have liked to have done better or done differently. So it is not without some critical edge. But part of this is to also just bring people back together that worked together 25 years ago. That's why we're 5 minutes late. It was hard to break away from chats. I want to start with a quick overview of the Act. So I'm going to invite someone, probably Jenny or Louise, to maybe just give us a kind of high-level summary of the Act, noting that some people in the room will have heard this 25 years ago, and some people online or in the room might be coming a little bit fresh to this. So Jenny, Louise, do you want to just kind of give a very potted overview of what the Act seeks to do, what it does? Louise.
The thing that I find really important about the Act for me is that it establishes a hierarchy of interventions into juvenile or, the offending of young people. I think we have a lot of things in other courts that are directed at a particular level of offending, but this one actually establishes a kind of pathway where you try and knock matters out before they even get to court. So we have a hierarchy which starts off with warnings, which can be issued by police for relatively minor matters and should be issued for relatively minor matters. We have cautions, which are supposed to be more an intensive type of intervention, usually, as I understand it, issued by police, but can be issued by magistrates as well. In an ideal world, and I don't know to what extent this happens, Aboriginal elders should also be involved in the cautioning process for Aboriginal young people. That was always intended. And then for higher levels of offending where there's clearly an issue going on, you have what's called a youth justice conference. And that is a facilitated process which is designed or was originally designed to help get an understanding of what the young person's needs were or are that are contributing to that offending behaviour and work out a response to that, how would you call it, a facilitated and agreed to response to that offending behaviour, which is then given to the magistrate to what do you call it? I've forgotten the language. Richard?
Approve the outcome.
Sorry?
Approve.
And then there's basically a plan for that young person that they have to go through. And I think that's it. And then obviously if it's beyond the youth justice conferencing stage, then you've got the court process. But it was meant to kind of constantly filter things down so that they didn't come to court. And the idea was that once the Act had been there for a reasonable amount of time, you would have very, very few matters actually having to come to court.
Excellent summary. Thank you. We'll add to that as we go, but that's kind of a useful summary for our purposes. So I want to turn to some of the factors that led to the development and then implementation of the Act. And I'm going to draw kind of heavily on this side of the panel for this part of the discussion. I'm reminded by having read some of the literature from the 80s in preparation for this event, just how low diversion was in New South Wales. And just to put that in context, in the early 1980s, about 1,000 police cautions were issued and about 18 or 19,000 matters went to children's courts. Diversion wasn't really practiced in New South Wales. And there are a variety of reasons for that we can potentially unpack. But the reality was diversion didn't happen in New South Wales. There'd been efforts to increase diversion through Commissioner's instructions in the New South Wales Police, but they didn't necessarily take hold in quite the way legislation later did. So this was a kind of key driver, but there are a number of drivers, and I'm going to ask Jenny to reflect on some of those drivers, particularly from the late 80s, early 90s. The kind of 87 legislation, the major reforms, Children Criminal Proceedings Act, Children Detention Centres Act, Children Community Service Orders Act, a variety of acts that came in that fundamentally shifted our youth justice system away from welfare to justice. But there was a lot more occurring in the late 80s and 90s that I think set in train developments towards the culmination of the Young Offenders Act. Can you speak to some of those, Jenny, please?
Thank you, Garnet. Yes. But before I do, I'd just like to acknowledge some of the people who were involved in bringing the act to fruition, if you like, who are no longer with us. In particular, Bill Grant, who chaired the working party that brought together people from a multitude of different departments and different perspectives, very senior people mainly, and finally got to an agreement about what the act should look like across very diverse views, and Louise was very much involved in that as well. So I acknowledge Bill, who then went on to head up Legal Aid and passed away shortly after he retired. Valet Bill, and yes, we appreciate and recognise and salute the work that he did in getting the Young Offenders Act to the point, well, the bill to the point where it went through Parliament. The other person I'd like to acknowledge, perhaps is not so well known, but has also passed on, is one of our first conveners, Maurice Mathis, who some of you may remember. Maurice passed away 12 months ago. He was probably one of our oldest conveners, but he was also very instrumental in shaping my thinking about the role of conveners in the youth justice conferencing process. So to go back to your question, Ghana, I think we could start perhaps with the Australia becoming a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989. It seems like a lifetime away, and probably, well, we don't have that many young people here, but before some were born. I was getting used to teaching students who were, anyway. So that was 1989, and that was significant in the shaping and the writing of the influential report by the Youth Justice Coalition called Kids in Justice, which was published in 1990. We were starting to plan a 30-year anniversary celebration for that, and then COVID got in the way, so we weren't able to celebrate the Kids in Justice report being 30 years old, and how much of that, the recommendations from that report were actually implemented. And I mention that because it was a lesson for me. Michael Hogan, who was at the time at PIAC, Public Interest Advocacy Centre, was one of the driving forces, and then he moved into government. And I learned lots of lessons from him about how to get regulations implemented. Basically, you have to go to the politicians or whoever it is that is going to be responsible for doing, and really just keep pressing them, keep arguing the case, and keep arguing it sensibly and with good will, even if you tend to disagree with the person that you're trying to bring on board. So learning to work with people who have different views was also very much part of that, getting the Kids in Justice recommendations implemented. Some of those recommendations included the establishment of a separate Department of Juvenile Justice, and also the appointment of an independent Juvenile Justice Advisory Council. That council was responsible for putting together groups. this is the way we used to do policy development.
Green papers.
Green papers, white papers, draft bill legislation, perhaps. So the green paper drew together people working across the field of juvenile justice, right from police through to magistrates, and recommended basically a lot of the things that now sort of came to fruition in the Young Offenders Act, including a conferencing scheme that wasn't well thought out, but was there in those recommendations. So yes, there were also upper house committees that were working at that time, making recommendations. It seemed to me at that time, it was an exciting time because there was so much interest in changing the way that we responded to young people in trouble with the law.
Excellent. Yep. Do you want to add to that, Louise or Richard?
Oh, sorry.
You go.
I just wanted to add to it that in the early period where I was asked by Bill Grant to have a look at what was called community youth conferencing, which was a pilot. And apparently it wasn't working very well. It didn't have a legislative base. And Bill came to me, I just started at AG's, and he said, I want you to work on this, and explained to me it was all about restorative justice. I didn't know anything about restorative justice, but I thought, I don't like the sound of this. I think kids are going to be worse off. But it was my job, and I had to, work with the idea. I should say that was the only thing that was on the table at that point, was providing a legislative base to conferencing. The idea of the hierarchy came from the Kids in Justice report, and I read it and went, why can't we build this stuff in at the same time as we do? And Bill allowed me to do that. He also allowed me to whack in a reference to Croc. And I think the thing that was really exciting about it, or my role in that, was that Bill allowed me, even though this was my first departmental role, he had no problem with me going back to the community sector and saying, hey guys, tell us what we should do and how we should do it. And that really was the key to everything, was having that direct relationship with people in the community sector and the trust to go, you're going to give us good advice. If we can work this out together, I think we'll actually come up with something good.
Just
Richard.
to add to that, I think the family group conferencing that was going on in New Zealand was really, really important as well. Huge influence. But a really great overview of all of this can be found in the second reading speech. It's like 5 or 6 pages. And I read it this morning and I thought we sort of all sweated over that 6 pages. And there's really important sentences, but there's some fantastic historical stuff. And it's just a really nice summary for anybody that wants to read a second reading speech. And it was introduced by Jeff Shaw, who was the attorney at the time. So sort of all the right, stars were in alignment there.
I think it's really important to name names in a positive way, because this kind of work often, particularly in the scholarship, doesn't reveal itself through people's involvement. And I think it's particularly nice to also reflect on those people who are no longer with us, but who were absolute stars in pulling people together, creating relationships that Janet Chan's review that we'll talk a little bit about later highlighted as a real strength of the work that was done through the implementation. And that's part of the kind of idea of tonight, to reflect on that and celebrate that, but also say this is important for positive policy and law reform, to have that kind of coalition of the willing. Now, Richard just inadvertently said, when the stars align or something similar. I don't know whether Elaine's with us online, but Elaine Fishwick's PhD thesis is called When the Stars Align, looking at juvenile justice policy between 1990 and 2005. And that was the title of her thesis because that was what she felt was right about that period. Even the conversation that Louise and Jenny just had about the community sector and the kind of lawmaking part of government talking in this kind of open way, I think is also of value to reflect on and to hold on to in many respects, because I think there was a really vibrant civil society non-government sector at that time, publishing really seminal works like Kids in Justice report in 1990, but other reports that were really, I think, important for those of us in government to hear what young people were saying and what civil society groups were also saying. So there are a number of things that were swirling around this period. There was kind of a lot of optimism, I think, with parliamentary inquiries. I think the kind of names that you see, and Simons hasn't been mentioned, but role in kind of parliamentary inquiries through that period. And I just want to mention two things that we might reflect on. This is the benefit of hindsight. This is the benefit of time. We now know the 1990s was an incredibly high crime time in New South Wales. And I think this was not necessarily easy to see when you're in it, but Cabramatta was an open air drug market. There'd been a political assassination in Cabramatta. There were kind of issues around police stations being shot at Lakemba in the late 90s. It was a particularly high crime period that we now know was a high crime period, but you don't when you're in it. So it was a volatile period of law reform. This wasn't the only bit of legislation that got up in that era. There was also the police and public safety provisions. There was also the Children Protection Parental Responsibility Act, which was the bizarrest piece of legislation you might find.
I can get it back.
That's another event,
Just
Louise.
breakfast.
So I kind of want to, bring that into the discussion. But what I wanted to do is maybe pick up on Louise's point about her initial reaction was, well, this looks dangerous for kids, and kind of ask Richard about the kind of legal safeguards and how lawyers kind of felt about the legislation. We're moving towards the development of the legislation, and you appear in the Children's Legal Service kind of around that period. What were the kind of fears and concerns?
Look, I was also at a community legal centre before I went into legal aid, and the Youth Justice Coalition was a really active group around the community legal centres. So that also had that legal influence. But what was fundamental to all of us is that there had to be an admission made before a young person was eligible for a caution and conference. And what was critical in that is that they needed to get legal advice before they would make that admission, because there's a whole stack of concerns, whether it's a dolly incapax issue or whether they've got genuinely a defence that they might want to pursue and go to court instead. So it was about really setting up the youth hotline at legal aid, and there was a whole stack of solicitors that were involved in working on this after hours telephone line. But in the legislation itself, just if I could read one of the principles of the scheme under section 7 was the principle that children who are alleged to have committed an offence are entitled to be informed about their right to obtain legal advice and to have an opportunity to obtain that advice. So it was a fundamental cornerstone to where this all unfolded. And when I look at the Act, and if I could just say, it was really progressive for its day. 1997, if you go and look at the objects and throughout the legislation, throughout the cautions, the conference, the objects of the conferencing, the appropriate outcome plans, there's this legal framework built in about it should be least intrusive, least restrictive, no harsher than what you'd get at court. At any time a veto to walk away and go to court instead. It was really quite profound in its legal safeguards, and I think that's why we all got behind it.
And they weren't easy to get in.
No.
No.
Say more.
Well, there was a bit of a resistance to having lawyers involved. That was seen to be potentially interfering. I won't say where that resistance came from, with all respect to people who are no longer with us, but there was a bit of resistance. It's seen that it's going to interfere with the process, it's going to delay it, kids aren't going to admit. And then we're not going to get where we want to in getting, kids into conferences. So it wasn't easy. We've got there in the end, but I think again, that was around the trust in the end, the trust that was built between, people in the Youth Justice Coalition and people in the department. And can I just add a little anecdote, because I'm dying to put it in there somewhere. One of the things that went a bit wrong with the drafting was that it was supposed kids who had small amounts of dope were supposed to be able to get the benefit of a warning or a caution. Now, I went on maternity leave somehow when the matter was being drafted by Parliamentary Council. My replacement forgot to put that in. It was just one of those mistakes. Anyway, it was into Parliament and we had a look at it. I'd come back from June. Oh no, you know, what's going to happen? We've got kids who we really want to be able to get the benefit of a warning or caution, and they're not going to get it for small amounts of marijuana. Anyway, I shall say, with all respect to people who aren't with us, and this probably should never happen in a government department, my boss, Bill Grant, said, can you go and talk to these guys and get someone to go and talk to the opposition and get them to put up an amendment so that we can get that back in, which was just, I'm going, am I going to lose my job for this? Whatever. And so that's what I was allowed to do. It was like, can you go that we didn't get it up because Bob Davis, who was the Premier, was absolutely
Bob Carr.
Bob Carr, sorry, not Bob Davis, sorry. Bob Carr, who was the Premier, wouldn't let it in, said no, absolutely, it's not getting in there, even though it had already been approved. But anyway, that's
and then amounts were capped. But also in that same point was that it became then an entitlement to a caution and an entitlement to a conference pursuant to, you know, the other safeguards. But what positive sort of rights-based legislation to actually give an entitlement for a caution or an entitlement for a conference. Yeah.
And just for those of who don't know, when Richard and his team set up the Legal Aid hotline, this was about trying to get legal advice to kids in police stations at the moment that they were in police stations. I reflected on some numbers through some of the research and found that soon after the commencement of the Act, there are in excess of 15,500 phone calls being received by that hotline, about 6,000 kids receiving advice, and many more referrals being made through that process. And this was kind of important cut and thrust kind of work of the time because, you know, as you can imagine, charging stations often didn't have a place to go for a young person to call lawyers. This wasn't the best circumstances to be giving advice, but really critical to ensuring that legal safeguards were being protected where possible and that young people weren't being offered inducements, young people weren't falsely kind of admitting guilt or being coerced into admitting guilt. But it also sets up one of the challenges, I think, that we've never particularly overcome. And the admission being a requirement to be diverted perpetuated some of the problems around underutilisation of diversion for Indigenous young people. And so I'm reminded of that same event that I mentioned earlier, the 1988 Sydney Institute of Criminology event on juvenile offenders, where Chris Kineen at the time had done research on police cautioning and said that about 20% of kids were not being diverted because of nil admissions. It's been a kind of an ongoing challenge across the years, grappling with that issue, ensuring that legal safeguards are protected, but also opportunities for diversion are afforded to young people. Can I just ask, before we move into kind of hearing from Joe and Michaela about some of the kind of graft in implementing the legislation, which others will also contribute to. Jenny mentioned a number of things that were happening. Green papers, white papers are really kind of a really vibrant policy-making period. Parliamentary inquiries, stuff happening in New Zealand, Braithwaite's publications about reintegrative shaming and Republican theory, a kind of a real vibrancy where I think many felt that alternatives to kind of formal criminal justice could be found. There was the development of the Minor Offenders Punishment Scheme and a working party that came together that then became the precursor to the Youth Justice Advisory Committee, which was inserted into the legislation as an oversight group. And I think it's really important to reflect on that group because Janet Chan's review talks about the power of the relationships. So does Elaine Fisherwick's PhD, talks about the kind of deep relationships, which are kind of echoed here. Some of these people are continuing to be friends that met through some of this work. And I think it's really important to reflect on the importance of those relationships for the implementation. But Louise, Jenny, Richard, do you want to kind of comment on MOPS or YJAC as a kind of important body in getting this stuff done?
Right. I'll let you go.
I remember sitting in the upper house at 3 a.m. as the legislation was going through And Anne Simons was particularly passionate about an upper house member who was chair of the Social Issues Committee and had undertaken a lot of the research and reporting for the reports that were published around that time that Garner's mentioned. And she saw me sitting there, and I'd had dealings with her when we were trying to implement the recommendations from CROP. And she said, Jenny, come over here. We need to make an amendment, and I want you to give me the wording. They need an advisory committee. So yes, some of that was very last minute stuff, but and reflecting on the role of the Youth Justice Advisory Committee and comparing it to the Juvenile Justice Advisory Council that had been established some time earlier. In hindsight, I think maybe that the Juvenile Justice Advisory Council should have been the committee with, you know, or should have formed a subcommittee drawing from the Mox Working Party. Because I think that, and some of you may know this, but I think that they probably felt a bit sidelined, the advisory council. Yeah. And it would have been better to draw them in at that stage. Nonetheless, Wajak did some fantastic work.
It was very much a kind of replication of the working group that had worked on the legislation. But yes, as you say, I think it kind of might not have had the power that we had hoped that it would have. And there were issues post-implementation with, and this is not, you know, saying there was anything wrong with the Act itself, but there were issues with the Premier not really embracing the legislation. Unfortunately, he just stayed completely silent. He was still banging on about kids running around with their hats on backwards. And there was something else I was going to say about Wajak. I can't remember. It's gone straight out.
Well, there was the amendment in 2007 for the abolition of the Youth Justice Advisory Committee.
That's right. Yeah.
But just one other kind of loose point that was around this time was that there were all these other kind of ad hoc schemes happening at police stations or at people's, you know, sports clubs, and it was kind of, you know, hybrids of cautions and conferencing. And one of the great things about the legislation was that it kind of abolished all those other loose and slightly, you know, some of them concerning schemes. So it was good for that as well. Just as a bit of background.
Yeah, the community aid
panels.
Yeah.
Which Jenny has written about and critiqued because of this kind of proliferation of local activities. At one level, we might want to encourage that, but that particularly loses a capacity for equity. You get issues around justice by geography. You get groups who hijack these community aid panels, and young people end up with really quite significant outcomes.
Hundreds of hours of community work for matters that if you came to court, you get a 6-month bond under a, you know, the that's not obvious.
Yeah. There was a very strong victims advocacy movement at the time, which took on the restorative justice mantle and did things with it that were a bit concerning, as Richard said.
Just a little.
Yeah.
And victims were represented on the Youth Justice Advisory Committee, Martha Jabor from Homicide Victim Support Group, and others were influential in advocating for restorative justice and the Act, including Ken Marslew, Enough is Enough, and others in the kind of victims lobby space. And so that kind of coalition of those characters at the time, including, I think, someone that hasn't been mentioned yet, but we're going to start to move towards some of the policing. Assistant Commissioner Ike Ellis, who I ultimately then worked for a period, who was the complete champion of diversion and the Young Offenders Act within the New South Wales Police Service, as it was then known. And the importance of having police on board was absolutely critical. We were operating at about 1,000 or a couple of thousand cautions. That was the full extent of diversion prior to the introduction of the Act. That jumped up soon after the implementation of the Act to around 10,000 per annum and has largely stayed at that level ever since. It's dipped a little recently, but that's because youth crime has largely dipped a little. So we're still running at about 7,000 police cautions per annum, thanks to data from Karen Freeman from Bureau of Crime Stats, who sent me some data before this evening. So the kind of champion in police was part of YJAC, was kind of part of the interagency working party. And can I say, this might be controversial, but having someone in a position who was youth spokesperson for many years matters. I go to meetings now and there is a kind of shifting sands in a number of key seats where you go, oh, what, you weren't here at the last meeting, who are you now? The kind of turnover in some of these portfolios makes it very difficult to kind of do the work Ike did, which included recruiting 80 youth liaison officers around the state. There had been a former role, but this was kind of brand new recruitment of 80 youth liaison officers in each of the police commands that have been set up. And all of the advocacy kind of both up and down the organisation to embrace diversion, which was a hard sell. This wasn't an organisation necessarily predisposed to letting young people off. So I want to move to implementation now, and Jenny set up the Youth Justice Conferencing Directorate and recruited an amazing group of conference administrators, one of which is Michaela. I'm laughing because I was also one. And Michaela and Joe respectively did work in their own organisations. Joe as the principal tutor down at the academy, needing to train police. Now, I just want to touch on a couple of things before we invite them to speak. 1997, according to the annual report, the police annual report at the time, there were 13,414 sworn police officers. Training that volume of police is no easy task. And unless you've been given that as a responsibility, I don't think you really appreciate the difficulties. It was in the same period that we had new child protection legislation come in that had a fine to up to $20,000 for anyone who knew about child abuse who didn't report it. That spooked the police quite a lot and was an act that they were interested in because there are potential penalties. Forensic Procedures Bill had been slated and was coming in. And this massive thing that I don't think anyone realises anymore, the Sydney Olympics, was looming. And it just completely dominated a lot of thinking and training. And so Joe and others had responsibility for educating the police on diversion and the Young Offenders Act. So I'm going to invite Joe to speak about kind of some of her early memories. Some of the most fond memories of my professional career were at the Police Academy in late 97, early 98. And then I'll move to Michaela to think about the training of specialist youth officers, which I think is in Elaine Fishwick's thesis I reread this afternoon. It says that training was possibly one of the best adult learning activities ever implemented in the police. And I want to reflect on that. And I agree with that comment. Joe, can you kind of tell us about the enormous task of training police in diversion of young people?
Thanks, Garner. Thanks for the invite to come down for this. I'll just start by explaining a little bit about how I came into this role. There was another senior constable. I was a sergeant at the time. There was another senior constable at the academy, Joanne Cotty, and she was given the task of being the principal tutor for youth. And she initially was there when the 80 youth liaison officers were identified, and then they started doing some training with them. And I think they had a big conference at the academy at the time, and I wasn't part of that. My role was domestic violence, and I was working very hard in that space. And Joe went on leave. She came and saw me. She said, I'm going on leave for 2 weeks. Can you just keep an eye on the youth stuff, just youth stuff, for a couple of weeks for me? And then, and I said, sure, not a problem. She never came back. And so then I inherited the youth stuff, as well as I also maintained the domestic violence principal tutor role. And I did that for 4 years. So it was a massive eye-opener for me to see that. And but it kind of tied in for me. It made sense to me, I guess, because of that work I was doing in domestic and family violence, particularly around early intervention and risk and protective factors for young people and all of those things. So when I started to kind of wrap my head a little bit around the Young Offenders Act, it kind of tied into some of that. And it was a huge challenge, I would say, to do that, to get that information out into the broader police force. So we did that in a number of ways. There was, we have annual mandatory training. So there was a mandatory training package that was rolled out to everybody. It was quite bland. I will say it was very much just, this is it. And it was just sent out as a package, an education officers would have done with it what they will and presented it in a variety of ways. So that was very hit and miss, but that's how a lot of the information first went out. There were some articles in some of our internal journals and other documents. And then I found out about this workshop that had been sort of planned and run and organised totally to the side of the normal education and training process. So, and that was the Specialist Youth Officers Workshop. And I won't steal any of Michaela's thunder because she was the genesis of that with a couple of youth liaison officers down in Goulburn and down in Queanbeyan. And they did an incredible job of pulling together this training package, which then sort of landed in my lap, I guess, to do something with and to try and get that out. So it was obvious that we needed to train as many people as specialist youth officers as possible, but we didn't want to dilute that training to the point where those roles weren't considered important and people weren't given opportunity for training. So we, it was a real challenge. That was probably a massive challenge, was to train up trainers to spread that word and deliver a package that was very different to any other training package that New South Wales Police had ever encountered, a very experiential learning package. The second reading was in the package. Police were reading the second reading speech as part of the training. So, you know, they'd be like, what's this? But we made them read it and we made them talk about it and work through it. And it helped to turn their minds a little bit away from maybe the way they used to think, to look at things in a whole different way. So yeah, so we did that. So we started by training up our youth liaison officers to become facilitators. And then we would go out and do like train the trainer, and it sort of went from there. So we went from having our 80 youth liaison officers to having over 1,000 police trained as specialist youth officers. And that they ranged from mainly sergeants. We targeted that rank because they were very influential in police stations. They were the gatekeepers often with charging and alternatives to charge. So we really did target them, but they were a very difficult group of people to change minds, hearts and minds, but we did challenge that. And senior constables as well. So they were our main cohorts that we put through the training. It's now certainly gone a lot beyond that as well, but that was our initial group. And like I said, we did over 1,000, and Michaela and I would often go out on these road shows to spread the word. I would say one of the things with the Young Offenders Act from a police perspective, where I think it was effective, is that it was like a presumption in favour of. So we'd always start with warning or no action at times. The presumption in favour of that. If you can't justify that, well, if you're not going to do that, how do you justify going to that next step? And if you're not going to caution, and you should, then how are you going to justify doing a referral for a conference? And then finally, if you can't do any of those, explain to me, justify and put in writing why a charge is appropriate. So that was a change really, where previously it was a presumption in favour of a charge, and then you would kind of look at those other options. And when we delivered the training and we educated as much as we could, we would always go the opposite, so that people weren't thinking as a charge as the most. That wasn't, you know, I won't say they all did because I'm police, but you know, that wasn't the goal, was that they would just default to a charge. We wanted them to default to least restrictive form of sanction. So yeah, that's how we sort of kicked it off.
Can you speak to some of those experiences, Michaela? 1,500 SYOs, according to some information I read today, had been trained in the first few years. The enormity of that task, because of all of the stuff that is going on in that organisation, the geography of this state that meant lots of people were away for long periods of time training police for a couple of days. Like the SYO training wasn't just hours. Now, this might not mean much to you if you haven't worked in the cops, but the kind of pressure on time and getting people released in custody manager roles, duty officer roles, kind of key positions for days to talk about young people and crime and diversion, I think is extraordinary in hindsight, but you managed it.
Yeah, I think initially, because I was doing a lot of that, talking to police at their general meetings and trying to convince them about the Young Offenders Act, and they were slowly coming to realise they had responsibilities under the Act that they hadn't been trained for, and asking, how do I do this? And I'm going to name drop. So one of my YLOs was also going on leave, John Webber, and that's why we put together the training. And I think it was just that there was that growing realization that this was not something that was going away, that was something that was the law that had to be applied. And we were constantly just at them. And the other thing that Joe didn't mention about the SYO training was that when we delivered it, it was delivered in tandem with a youth justice officer. So we demonstrated that collaborative relationship, and we built those relationships at different levels through the police and youth justice in those years through the training.
And the training was set up so that we would take turns leading the training. So there was no, there was no one was really pigeonholed. We would just alternate.
Yeah.
Some days you would do some parts, I would do a different part, and others would do other parts. So I think was really effective as well. And we wrote that into the training. So once the training kind of arrived, we then had to put a bit of structure around it in terms of having it endorsed as a police course. So it had like academic kind of thing, rigor, but probably wasn't, but anyway, that's what they, so it was good. Yeah. And but to do that, we wrote in there that the training must be delivered by someone who was accredited as a trainer, not just anybody, and it had to be co-facilitated by a youth justice conferencing. So that was, I think that was good, because as soon as we did that, we sort of kept that control, and we made sure that it stayed that way for quite a long time.
It meant that for at least 10 years, every police officer making decisions about young people was trained by a youth justice person and a trained police civil officer.
Facilitator.
And
Can I just add
please do,
to
Jen.
that? You've sort of skimmed over the fact that the training was such fun.
We turned looking up legislation into a game.
You did, yeah. And as far as using adult learning, it absolutely was a standout in all the sort of education and training I've been involved in. It was the best training that I have ever encountered. Beautifully put together. Drew the police officers in almost immediately, made them think about how they behaved as children and how many of them could have been locked up but weren't. and they loved it.
Yeah. They'd always come back on the second morning surprised at how much they'd learned.
Yes.
In the first day, they're like, I learned all that. I was thinking about this overnight.
Yeah, no,
And it was about shifting cultures, because even to have, every year we were, your Children's Legal Service solicitors were invited to be part of the training, and you'd spend like a day or 2 days working with police, and that was not usually, that didn't kind of happen, but people were, I think, on both sides learning a lot about people's roles by just doing that.
And doing it together, which again, none of this is kind of rocket science. Some of these decisions I think are made on the hop, how things end up, serendipity. But for me, looking back and reading Janet Chan's work, which I want to kind of move to in a moment, which was a review of the legislation. I just want to talk to some of the early evaluations for a moment. The term sympathetic interpretive community was a term that she used, which I think is really powerful. And I think what Joe and Michaela spoke of is the building blocks of a sympathetic interpretive community, where both organisations were prepared to talk to each other, exchange ideas robustly, but exchange ideas and arrive at a decision that worked best, mostly for young people. That sympathetic interpretive community, I think, started many years prior. I think MOPS, YJAC, I think people at the senior levels of organisations demonstrated what sympathetic interpretive community looked like. And those first conferences at Goulburn, despite the copious amounts of alcohol consumed, were amazing, because we walked in each other's shoes. We talked together in a place that was often forbidden for people outside of the police. And I think this is hard to kind of replicate necessarily, but to understand the importance of some of this stuff. I just want to quickly say something, and then I want to invite Jane in, who has sat studiously kind of looking academic in the background, and I'd like to kind of just bring her in from New Zealand. Jenny's directorate involved setting up 16 administrators. They recruited hundreds of conveners across the state. We all had to find venues to run conferences in. We had to go to our communities and tell them about this new thing. We had to kind of recruit senior figures in religious communities and culturally diverse communities to speak about the legislation. We had to train conveners. There were 700 conveners trained very quickly after the Act was commenced, kind of a massive process. And it was all uncertain. Decisions were being made about whether they'd be contractors or employees. We didn't want them as employees because we didn't want to kind of bureaucratize the work. We wanted it to be dynamic work that people did because they were passionate about it. So lots of kind of huge amounts of work behind the scenes in the Youth Justice Conferencing Directorate. I want to talk for a moment, and I'm conscious of time. I think at least those of us out the front could talk about this for hours, but we'll finish at 7 o'clock. The evaluation of the legislation and the fidelity of that evaluation, I think is somewhat unique. I could be proven wrong, but don't tell me tonight. Nancy Hennessy did a review very early on about the gatekeepers of the legislation. She looked at whether there was high compliance across agencies and made a number of very important recommendations early in the implementation of the Act. Lily Trimboli from the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research did a piece of work around youth justice conferencing and participants in conferencing. She got surveys to 969 conference participants quite early in the process to tell us that people generally were satisfied with conferences. They felt their voice was heard. It was an early indication and vindication of conferencing being important for victims of crime. Garth Luke and Bronwyn Lind did a comparison at Boxar between conferencing and court and came up with an early figure that said conferencing was more effective in reducing recidivism than court and certainly a lot cheaper. And so that was very useful early on. And then I want to mention Janet Chan's work, which brings me to Jane. I was reminded, and I know that no one buys this book anymore, reads it, but if there are any of my students in the room, read it, you'll do better in your classes and in life. This book by Janet Chan is a really important book, I think, because the work she did in the evaluation, I just want to read for a moment because it really struck me today how significant her work was. Her review of the legislation, which there was a review built into the legislation within 3 years, the Act had to be reviewed. Analysis of systems level data, really kind of big picture data. Were we seeing a bump in diversion? What was happening for particular kids in particular areas? Was there kind of disparities across the police commands? 39 interviews and 24 focus groups involving 182 participants with policymakers and practitioners. Interviews with young people, 39 who'd been cautioned, 37 who'd been conferenced. 35 caution, 36 conference family members of those young people, 39 victims who'd been conferenced, analysis of a random sample of 501 conferencing referral files, analysis of 110 cases referred by the DPP, analysis of policy documents and administrative documents in quite a short period. So Janet Chan was going to be here tonight, but couldn't be. That's an amazing amount of work. And I think that happens because of relationships with Jenny and others that got her in to do this work, but was absolutely critical for those of us working in the space to hear what was occurring. Now, Jane was a PhD student under Professor Janet Chan, and Jane probably attended more conferences than many people running the conferences. And I'd like to invite you, Jane, to kind of speak to some of your PhD work, which was also part of that really rich fabric of early evaluation that I think, as said, I think is a bit unique. Can you speak to those experiences, Jane?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Garner. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to be joining you. I wish that I could be there in person, but I'm in Wellington, New Zealand, out Aotearoa. It's very windy and wild. It's pouring with rain, as per what is typical in Wellington. I hope that it's not too noisy. So yeah, this conversation has been,
yeah, fascinating. And I could listen to you on the panel talk all night about those years. I do think that it was a very, very special time for Ngana. I'm very glad that you picked up on that phrase, which is one that I use when I'm teaching too, about the sympathetic, there's that sympathetic interpretive community, which is in the Reshaping Juvenile Justice book. And it was that confluence of factors and people and personalities and the bringing together of police, lawyers, human rights advocates, academics, researchers, over a long period of time in very, as I understand it, to be quite contested debate about what the Young Offenders Act might look like and why it should work the way that it does, as it does now. And that, that kind of sustained dialogue is what kind of is the foundation of the Young Offenders Act that we enjoy today. So I wanted to just point to that kind of contested history and to point to the huge amount of work that went into it. So in terms of my research, that period of time, the late 90s and early 2000s, were kind of like the halcyon days of early research in restorative justice. And I came into it because I wanted to work with Janet Chan for the reasons that you've identified, that her work is very detailed. It incorporates many methods, a huge amount of data, and importantly for me, I kind of came in as a junior researcher to work on that Young Offenders Act project, and Jenny Bargan was in the room, and she was a partner to the research, and so I was able to see modelled before me very kind of interesting discussions about how to do the research, and Jenny would say no and Janet would say yes, and it was quite formative for me. And I was out and about doing interviews for that project in Liverpool and Fairfield and all over New South Wales in terms of warnings and cautions before I went to start my PhD. And I remember Don Weatherburn saying that we really need more research, as we still do today, about warnings and cautions, but conferencing is way more sexy to research, right? So there's so much more done in that space. Before I kind of finish, I'll just say that the reason that, one of the other reasons that the Young Offenders Act is special is it is one of the very few, perhaps the only piece of legislation that I know of that built into it the capacity for a researcher or an observer to be there watching what happened. And that kind of points to the transparency, the desire to be courageous and to have other external eyes on what was going on. And that allowed people like me to go in and then observe 85 conferences in 3 different locations across New South Wales, 101 different young people that were committed an offence, and from that very large 85 conferences to build some quite detailed to be able to see quite detailed patterns of why conferencing was working. What was the convener's role? What was the role of emotion? What structures made it work, and what were the strengths and what were the limitations, and so forth. So the Young Offenders Act enabled that kind of detailed research. It's very, very unusual, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you, Jane. I'm also reminded that Boxar has, at least according to my count, conducted 13 separate studies into Young Offenders Act and aspects of the Young Offenders Act since its commencement. We have a rich body of work, and that has been supplemented by work outside of government agencies. The Youth Justice Coalition did an early study on the experiences of young people in kind of under the Young Offenders Act, and a variety of other studies outside of kind of governmental research. And I do think that is a hallmark of the relationships, but also a hallmark of an interest, a real interest in hearing about how the work was being received, how the work was being done, and what young people's voices were on the topic, and also victims. And I don't always feel the same spirit of inquiry operating perhaps today. Now, I'm very conscious of time, and in the very strong interest of restorative justice being about dialogue, I want to kind of open up an opportunity for people to pose questions. Those of you online can pop questions in the chat, and I'll direct them, particularly, include you, Jane, so continue to look studious and not windswept. I do want to take some questions, but one of the things I wouldn't mind getting the panel to ruminate on whilst we think about taking some questions is, is the risk of self-congratulations. Now, we all had skin in the game in various ways and therefore feel quite passionate about what we did. It's only natural that you want to do the best possible work and look back nostalgically. But there were things that didn't go quite according to plan. There are things and outcomes that perhaps haven't happened that we might have wished for in that original period. And I do want to kind of focus on that because I don't want this to just be a kind of positive spin campaign, though I do think we did lots of things incredibly well. So I am going to take questions from the floor. Just try to keep them questions. Monologues can wait to wine and canapes.
Yes, hello. A question perhaps for Louise, Jenny and Richard. I'm currently working in the field and I'm always trying to explain this to my clients and children and their parents, which is how did graffiti not be allowed to be a part of the act? What was the crisis in graffiti that meant that a break and enter could get a caution, but possessing a spray can can't?
Well, it can be court
In court,
referred,
yes, of course.
But you're right, it was really disappointing that it was not. There's a number of areas that didn't get it there. But graffiti, I agree, it was political, you know, people.
It was
I think there was
purely
stuff on the war memorial. There was some really high profile stuff at the time, but the court. Yes.
Yeah, it was taken out. It was taken out.
Yeah, you're right.
One of the
Yeah.
first conferences that
Yes.
we were talking,
You're
it
right.
was graffiti where some kids went and spray painted a memorial down the south.
That's right.
Yeah,
It was the
right.
police
Yeah.
referred conference. So yes, I mean, there was a huge uproar about graffiti on the war memorial in Hyde Park.
Yeah.
And a lot of very negative comments about, you know, these kids should be hung, drawn and quartered,
Yeah.
basically. And definitely not go to a soft option like conferencing or a police caution. Oh, that's far too soft. So yeah, it was the politics of it more than anything, Kate.
Absolutely.
Sadly.
And do we think it could change? Maybe that's a
Hopefully.
question for other people.
I hope so. No.
Do you want to comment now
Well,
on where will it change
well,
whilst you're president of the Children's Court?
I thought I'd start with thank you. I haven't known the system without the Young Offenders Act. So when I first came in as a lawyer, it was in existence. So I'm the president of the Children's Court, and I've seen it from a different lens because I've only known it existing, and I have worked with Jane and I've seen her phenomenal tables that she's annexed to the Royal Commission submissions, and I know the benefits across jurisdictions of conferencing particularly. But in listening to Louise about the hierarchy, it is critical. And I've been involved in training at the academy, and I've been at the Assistant Commissioner for the Youth Command now saying, you got to talk to Joe. We've got to look at this interagency training and how to make it fun, because I think now in the academy, there'll be training for the new students, but I don't know what the consistency is for the specialist youth officers. And I don't know what the oversight is of who's making decisions about when to charge and what to charge. And we can do that work. But as to what changes, so the things that I see, the void in referrals for sex offences and trying to work with the police and policing culture to see that it might actually be better for victims if those referrals are made. Knowing that there is a draft sitting before Cabinet and knowing what some of the carve-outs have been, because admissions are a key part. When you look at the statistics about a child's first appearance being before the court and the overrepresentation of young Aboriginal people first appearing before the court is, I think, in part how policing decisions are made, but in part because young Aboriginal people offend younger and they're eligible for dolly. And so that then they'll be advised to go to court, but that means that they are fast-tracked into the system and get systemic responses. So there are these things that we can build from, where we've seen the extraordinary ground that was made and recognising at the time how unusual it was, and to recognise each of your contribution to a reform that has been essential, but also to see where there are opportunities for there to be change. And I think with the new government, there is will. And I do think in the stars align, there are really strong players across stakeholders who work together beautifully, and through those relationships, there will be change. But in sitting here, I'm going to be led a bit by Richard and Jenny and Louise and Joe, I suppose, having only met Michaela tonight. What was hard and what do we do and how do we do it better? Because that's something that will help us fast track those necessary amendments. That was a monologue.
You're allowed. Jenny, do you want to respond? And then there was a question over this side.
Response, yeah, be a short one. I think one of the major sticking points, and I think it's still one, is the meaning of admissions under the Young Offenders Act. Are they different from a full admission for court purposes? And I think that is still not completely resolved.
There's a lot of work being done with the cops right now.
Good. Pleased to hear that.
And there's a legislative package that's been sitting for a while now in government.
On that point.
On a number of proposals that, to my mind, would improve the Young Offenders Act.
But can I say, there's also section 67 of the Act that says, in terms of certain statements that are inadmissible. So if a young person says something in a caution or a conference, any statement, confession, admission or information made or given by the child cannot be admitted in evidence in any subsequent criminal or civil proceedings. So there is a nice safeguard built in there. Yeah.
I think because the Act was so new and fresh when we first rolled this training out, we had to really pull apart some of those concepts in a lot of detail. So we spent a long time talking about admissions, a long time looking at the principles of the Act, like a long time. And I think one of the things that can happen over time is that something becomes just business as usual, is that you kind of cut out some of those things that we would spend a really, really long time talking about admission. And what gets you over the line where you really do think that it's a better option. So, how would we do that? And that was even like educating police about what conversations to have on the hotline. So, because often kids, sometimes they're not their best advocate when they're just, you hand them a phone and they're in a charge room and you go talk to this number and what are they going to say, So sometimes we then we didn't realize this either. I think we started realizing we needed to train police a little bit more on how to engage with other stakeholders better, to work together like lawyers, absolutely. And so in the best interests of the child.
The draft MOU.
Yes.
But before we go to the next question, Jane, do you want to just comment on, I know you've been doing a lot of work around restorative justice and sexual assault. Do you just want to kind of make mention of that? And if you have any kind of crystal ball comments, and then we'll go to the next question in the room.
Yeah, I mean, as everyone in the room would know, for a long time, kind of very violent offences where a young person would end up in custody, or sexual violence offences were not able to go to conference. In fact, there is a way for magistrates to refer matters out and to refer out to community-based services like the one that I've co-founded with the Deacon Greenwood, Transforming Justice Australia, which is specialist sexual violence restorative service, working in that capacity. So look, I think there's, I guess, for me, it's the Young Offenders Act is about with the hierarchy that's been mentioned by Louise and Jenny and Richard. It starts with the philosophy that kids and young people do well when they can, and that our job is to give as many opportunities as possible for young people, children and young people, to learn and to grow, and to be supported, whether they're a victim or whether an offender. And for me, that means it doesn't matter what behaviour has occurred, including harmful sexual behaviours. There is, in my view, the capacity for alternative options to be considered. And I know that Nell is quite supportive of this too. Might like to speak to it.
Thanks, Jane. Is there a question? Can you just pop the microphone just for the people online? Thank you.
G'day, my name's Roy Butler. I'm the member for Barwon, which is a state seat. I've got a significant problem with young offenders in some of my communities at the moment, like Burke and Walgett and Condobolin. Others to a lesser extent. Burke's probably the highlight at the moment. The real problem is that these young people commit these offences and go to court. There's very little options for diversion. So even if we had the option of saying to them, would you prefer to do something else? We don't really have many places that they could go instead of either a custodial sentence or be bailed. And very often they're reoffending, which is obviously frustrating for the police because they're picking up the same people. pretty serious offences too. I'm just wondering if there's any changes that could be made to the Act to, I suppose, really force the hand of the new government to actually make sure that there are alternatives, there are diversionary programs. There's not a lot of pro-social influence around for some of these kids. And obviously we don't want to see them continue down a path of youth crime and into adult crime and into the adult prison system. So please help.
I think I was just going to say with the conferencing system, and this is something that I'm not sure has been implemented maybe as well as it could have been. When the plan's being developed or that process is happening where there's risks being identified with that young person. At the time, it was very heavily reliant on existing services. It kept being referred to existing services in the community, whether it be housing or health or whatever it was. We didn't get with it a package of funding that would go and provide support to services to help kids who were going through that conferencing process who needed that extra, some extra level of assistance. I think that is something that could, maybe it's one option is to look at how to build or provide some of those services that, even if it's through, well, the thing is you need a service to pay them, but even if you had some funding that was available, like we now have in the drug court for people who might need some additional services to be provided to them, whether, those sorts of things could be considered. But it was very heavily reliant on what's out there. And in places where there isn't much out there, that is a problem. You're going to have a kid with problems who needs a whole lot of, issues dealt with, but not many services can actually help them with it.
Yeah, I think the regional and remote communities were our biggest challenge, and remain so, as you are well aware. And I think part of that is because of the dearth of services, the dearth of people who were trained to respond to young people in trouble. I also, remember that we were very thin on the ground. The police local area commands out there are huge. One youth liaison officer to cover that whole area. Our geographical areas for the conference administrators, the original conference administrators, were and remain geographically enormous, far too big for one person in my view. Those of you who are working in youth justice today may be able to give me some good news. Maybe there are some more conference staff out there in those rural and remote communities, but they can't make a difference if there are no services available. And I think in order to think about what you can do, have a look at what Just Reinvest has been doing in Burke, because I think that is your model of bottom-up, top-down community engagement, where the community itself is saying, look, this is what we can do, but this is where we need help, and bring in people. So strengthen the work of Just Reinvest, encourage its development in other towns and areas in your electorate, and somehow or other get more trained people on the ground. I don't know the answer to that, but I know that it should very much be part of the solution. Does that help?
It does. Familiar with Just
I'm sure you are. Did you? Yeah. And have you met the local area commander and the youth liaison officer out there? Yeah.
I think the kind of issues you speak to are really hard to tackle in a kind of, particularly an event like this. And I think they sadly kind of reflect, when part of this work was being done in the 90s, there were events in country towns declaring the need for law and order kind of responses. We had many, many more young people in custody back then than we have today. And I think that is actually part of the success, not just of the Young Offenders Act, but just kind of generally speaking. We've got about 200 kids in custody, only about 70 on control orders. There were over 450 when the Act commenced, roughly 500 kids in custody, the bulk of whom were on control orders. So I think there's been a really important shift But I do hear, as others in the room hear, these kind of alarm bells ringing about certain areas not doing well at the moment. And the difficulty of that kind of response after possibly, I can say it because I work in an academic institution, years of neglect in funding community services in places where it's all fly in, fly out workforce, where people don't feel like they have a connection into local service providers. And that doesn't get turned around quickly. And it's hard to recruit and keep people in those places that you know far better than I. So I'll let Richard talk.
No, I just want to say one thing in terms of the principles again of the legislation. It does say under section 7, and little h, it says that the principle that overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island children in the criminal justice system should be addressed by the use of youth justice conferences, cautions and warnings. And I think, you know, without us not acknowledging that that's one of the huge disappointments, we haven't done a whole lot there, really. I mean, I know there's been enormous amounts of work, but we've got to acknowledge that that's a failure of that section 7 principle, because there's still massive overrepresentation, and it's not, you know, it's not a good news story there. We've got to acknowledge that.
It was actually Aboriginal kids that was the focus of the Young Offenders Act. It was designed to try and reduce the overrepresentation of Aboriginal kids in custody. And yes, it has been, it's a major issue. It's a major issue in terms of the admissions process. I've been really disappointed to hear that Aboriginal elders have not been involved to the extent that we hope they would be in the cautioning process. That I'm just trying to think of what some of the other issues are, that there is still a significant disparity in, that Boxer has found in you know, and we're talking about equal level offences and equal histories in whether an Aboriginal kid gets a warning as opposed to a caution as opposed to court. There's still that disparity, significant disparity there that should not be happening. It's unequal treatment, and that,
It's one of the sort of sadnesses of my whole involvement in advocacy for young people, that when I started more than 25 years ago, the overrepresentation of Aboriginal kids in custody was about 25%. And now
About 60 at the moment.
So a lot more needs to be done in that space.
Just put that in context. So the kids in custody, the numbers have fallen. The numbers of Aboriginal kids have largely tracked the same number for many years. The percentage has gone up. And so this has kind of been the challenge, I think, for all of us, that much of the reform has worked very well for non-Aboriginal kids. And that could be a variety of reforms, not just what we're talking about tonight. And so I, again, reminded, because I read the proceedings to the Institute event, 1988 juvenile justice event, Chris Kinane saying, you know, if we are serious, then any reforms in this space really have to bite with Aboriginal young people. And I think we all kind of stand slightly miffed, more than slightly miffed, despondent in terms of the number of programs, projects, policies that have not budged kind of those issues. And I was at a youth justice centre recently and was just kind of deeply saddened by kind of some of the very young Aboriginal kids that I saw on lots and lots of charges, maybe from your patch. Now, I am a stickler for time. I don't know where that came from, but it's a legacy that I bring. Every event that I run finishes on time. Now, we are a couple of minutes ahead of time. Now, there's no kind of KPI that says I have to finish before time, but unless there are any other questions, I'm very conscious that we have good wine and food just outside that you won't be able to partake in, Jane, or the people online, and I apologise, but a big part of tonight was also saying stick, talk, be together, because that was a big part of the experience and the journey through the development and implementation of the Young Offenders Act. So if you don't mind, I might kind of close, and if there are any final comments, please share them. Jenny?
We haven't talked at all about training of conference administrators or conveners. And I don't really want to go on about that, but I do want to acknowledge the work of John McDonald and David Moore in doing our initial training for the conference administrators, and then the very initial training for the conveners in Sydney. But I also want to acknowledge Michaela's role in developing much of that training so beautifully. Thank you. Such an adult educator. But I'd also like to acknowledge Ken Buttram, who was the head of juvenile justice at the time that I was appointed. He's still with us, but only just.
Sadly, his wife passed away
Yeah.
in the last 10 days.
Yeah, and there are many other people that
I'd like to acknowledge Dax and Hendo.
Yeah, the two young cops, well, they were young at that time, who I formed a relationship with when I was working on the green paper, the entry into the system committee. And these two, Steve Henderson and Darren Stedman, were so enthusiastic and so wonderful. It was my first real sort of introduction to working with police officers instead of standing outside and going, you guys could do it better. Because I'd worked with young unemployed people beforehand, and they kept coming in and saying, the cops picked me up and all I had was just a joint in my pocket. And it was constant. So my passion originally was reforming the policing of young people.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Yeah, Joe, of course.
I just want to acknowledge you and what you did in terms of your role as the senior policy officer for youth for the New South Wales Police at the time, because obviously we all worked you're in Sydney, you know, I was in Goulburn, Kyla was in Queanbeyan, but you know, we were always on the phone to each other constantly, having quite lengthy conversations and discussions and arguments and whatnot about different aspects of it. But I think that was also really important, that we all were able to support each other and really kept driving the training and driving that conversation. So thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Joe.
Definitely.
Thank you, panel. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Please do stay. There's lots of catering. Please enjoy. And I just want to say in closing, a great thank you to the panel for giving up their time, for driving long distances, Michaela and Joe in particular, and a couple of panel members who couldn't make it, Tim Matthews, who was going to come, the first operations manager in
Nuts and bolts man.
Youth Justice, and Janet Chan, who was going to but couldn't. And I want to say, we've just set up a youth justice research collaboration, a level 1 research centre in the law school in the university focused on youth justice issues. One of the things I want to do is connect people who used to be in the system with people who are now in the system in a variety of ways. There is an incredible wealth of talent that is heading towards retirement or sitting in retirement that I want to be part of some of the thinking. So you'll see more events of this kind. Maybe it's kind of, you know, I'm approaching some nostalgic phase of my life, but I kind of want to get people connected. And so please keep an eye out for some of the events, because I think this is really important that we share across generations. Thank you again. Please stay, have a drink. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.